This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On the anniversary of American independence, journalist and First Amendment expert David Shipler says there's a mixed picture of free speech. Legally, you can say anything you want, but there are sometimes invisible cultural limits. Political reform advocate Lee Drutman says the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision is not helping corporations run Congress as much as old-fashioned lobbying is. And Bill Press talks with New York Congressman Paul Tonko, an opponent of TPP. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Free speech expert David Shipler gives us an Independence Day review of free speech, a free press in the Internet era, and the merits of whistleblowing by Edward Snowden. And we say hello to David Shipler, who reported for the New York Times from 1966 to 1988 in New York, Saigon, Moscow, Jerusalem, and Washington, and is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His latest book, Freedom of Speech, Mightier Than the Sword. David Shipler, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, we appreciate you being with us, of course. Your book is a survey, and a depressing one, about the state of free speech and free press in America. Is the past century of a free, robust, and independent something we won't see again?
Oh, no, I don't think so at all. In fact, the survey is a series of vignettes and stories about individual people who push the envelope or who try to push back on other people who are trying to speak in a way that's uncomfortable for certain groups. It's not so much a legal book. We think about freedom of speech as a legal concept, which it is, but also there's a cultural landscape that we enjoy and we live in. It's a vast landscape of robust speech, lots of different ideas flying around, much easier to get your ideas out with the internet than it used to be, and so forth. And I think we have a very mixed picture in this country. On the one hand, you can say just about anything you want to. On the other hand, there are cultural limits. Sometimes they're invisible, that people trip across, and they get punished for things that they say. I'm thinking, for example, of racist speech or anti-gay or lesbian speech, things like that, which some people are punished for and some people are not. So I think it's hard to generalize about whether we're, in a time of contraction of the latitude of speech or expansion. I mean, I think that we have a lot of information flying around. I mean, I think the real problem actually is the problem of listening. The freedom to speak implies the freedom to listen. If people are not listening to the speaker, then the speaker is talking to himself. It's a tree falling in the forest. And what we have in this country, and partly because of the internet, partly because so much mass media now is politically biased, that people get into their own boxes of comfort. That is, their zones of like-mindedness. So online, they'll go to the websites that they happen to prefer. They'll watch either MSNBC or Fox News, depending on their political preferences. So you don't get the kind of cross-fertilization of ideas in the sort of public square that you used to have. It's not that people are not free to listen or hear or choose what they listen to or read. They are, but they're not inclined to do that quite as much, I think, as it used to be.
I would absolutely agree with that 100%. So kind of interesting, how do we even define the press in an age of the internet, blogs, tweets, where so-called citizen journalists are beating mainstream media at their own game? I mean, if the New York Times deserves constitutional protection, does someone trashing the Kardashians online deserve it also?
Yeah, that's the $64 question, isn't it?
That's putting a higher price on it, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the courts have, gotten to the point of addressing this problem very well. And so it's really an open question. I mean, my own feeling is that, first of all, the First Amendment, and now we are talking about legal issues. The First Amendment does name the press explicitly as having the right, a free press. So if, to the extent that the courts decide that a particular government action, and remember the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights restricts only what government can do, not what private entities can do. So if the courts were to address the problem of government trying to shut down a blogger, let's say, for some reason, I think that that's a really gray area because it's not clearly the press, but whereas a newspaper is. So if you had, for example, a blogger publishing the Pentagon Papers now rather than the New York Times, what would the First Amendment tell you about that? How would the blogger have that right of press freedom? I think we don't know the answer to that because we haven't really considered it very closely. The same thing would be true about protecting the anonymity of sources. Virtually all states have shield laws. The federal government does not, but the states have shield laws that require prosecutors to go through hoops to get a reporter's testimony to identify a confidential source. In general, they have to show that they can't get the information anywhere else, that it's urgent that they do, that it's essential to the case, and so forth. And that's all framed around the First Amendment, not to intimidate or inhibit the press gathering its information. So I suppose one could imagine a blogger or somebody tweeting who says something and attributes it to an anonymous source, and a prosecutor sees it and says, "Oh, I want to know who that drug dealer is. I'm going to subpoena you, and you're going to have to come into the grand jury room and tell us." I can imagine a blogger going to court and trying to protect himself against that kind of subpoena at the state level, and I don't know if he would succeed. I think it's an open question.
We're speaking with David Shipler, and he's Pulitzer Prize-winning author, of course, but his latest book, Freedom of Speech, Mightier Than the Sword. And Dave, you devote a chapter to the recurring efforts of school boards to ban certain works of literature, but what about campus speech codes and hate speech laws and regulations? As much as they're meant to correct wrongs, aren't they just as odious as attempts from the political right to censor ideas and speech?
I think it depends on how they're framed and how they're implemented. There's a clash in the law between the right to free speech, the First Amendment, and here we're talking about state institutions because the First Amendment, again, applies to government. So if you have a state university, say the University of Oklahoma, which is an interesting case because you had these fraternity brothers chanting racist speech and songs and a song, and two of them were expelled. The question would be, were they just exercising their First Amendment right, no matter how odious it is, or were they creating an atmosphere of hostility and intimidation for African American students, which was the university's argument? And the university is obligated to prevent such an atmosphere from developing so that all students can study, without being intimidated and that sort of thing. So there's a real contradiction between the First Amendment rights and the right to be free from intimidation and marginalization and so forth. My own feeling about this personally is that more speech is the answer to odious speech is more speech. That is, the rebuttal is the best approach. That you have people saying horrible things. Let the community come together, use it as a teaching moment, convene discussions and seminars, get the student body involved and the faculty, and make that an experience that everyone can benefit from, rather than just a matter of punishment. And I think that I think a lot of colleges have taken this approach, especially state universities that are pretty much restricted from enacting speech codes. Now, private colleges are a different matter because unless there's some state law that it gets into the picture, private colleges generally can have speech codes or honor codes in which civil discourse is mandated, and they're freer to punish students who violate those codes. But again, there too, I think it's an awful lot better to use these things as teaching moments. I mean, I remember I was on the board of trustees at one private college for a while, and there was one of the fraternities staged what they call a ghetto party. You know, there's not an all-white fraternity, but there were no blacks in it. There were a couple of Latinos, I think, a couple of Asians, but they, got Afro wigs and they dressed up in what they thought were gang colors and that sort of thing. When word of this leaked out, they were subject to opprobrium for sure, and the college did a very good thing. At the impetus of white students, actually, they organized seminars and discussions. I went to one of them, and it was really interesting. They had a panel of professors, and then the crowd broke up into small groups of 5 or 6 people each to talk about this and to explore this insidious racism that, kind of operates in our society. So I really think that's a better approach than kicking the kids out. I mean, I think it's not if they do something violent, it's different. If they,
right.
If they took a student and hazed him in an illegal manner, that's another question. But for pure speech, which is what the Oklahoma situation was, I'm a real First Amendment guy, and it bothers me. I'm a big free speech advocate.
I hear you. I hear you. Absolutely. I think probably the most troubling chapter of your review of press freedom is the one about government suppression and intimidation of whistleblowers and reporters. But isn't it even worse under President Obama than it was under any previous Republican administration?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's really disappointing. Obama's Justice Department has gone after a whole bunch of leakers and prosecuted them, and it's really distressing because we need, as Jim Risen of the New York Times said, he's a great reporter, and he said, you'd be hard-pressed to find any coverage of the war on terrorism that doesn't involve classified information because it's all classified. And those of us who have worked in Washington know very well that government officials trade in classified information all the time. They release it selectively. They may sanitize it. You're not naming, undercover agents and that sort of thing. But they're giving you, as a reporter, you're getting information that is absolutely classified. And there used to be a kind of unwritten rule among reporters and government officials that, if they would give you this information and you would report it anonymously, you have to trust your sources, of course. You have to know that this person, this official, really is reliable, and better yet, you ought to try to confirm it with 2 or 3 other sources if you can. And what used to happen in that kind of situation is the CIA or the FBI, whoever was this official worked for, would call him in if they could figure out who it was. They'd call him in, and they'd read him the Riot Act, and maybe they would suspend him for a couple of weeks or something like that. But it was understood that this is the way information gets out to the American public. And when the government just classifies practically everything, it means that, and then goes and prosecutes people who disclose it, then it's going to be very hard for the American public to know what their government is doing, especially in national security areas.
With all of this government spying on its own citizens, whistleblowers going to prison, reporters being threatened, how close are we to becoming a police state?
Oh, I don't think we're coming close to becoming a police state. I mean, this is a vigorous, flagrantly open society. I worry, though, about this particular area that we've just been talking about. That is the reluctance of government officials, even government officials who are authorized to talk to the press, I'm told now, are very hesitant to do so. And that's inhibiting to the press. Now, some reporters, such as James Risen, who fought against his subpoena, he was subpoenaed in the Jeffrey Sterling case, a CIA operative or a CIA caseworker, I guess, who was accused and then convicted of giving him information about a very flawed operation to provide Iran with doctored plans for a particular nuclear device. I mean, it was really a bungled operation, and it's important for the American public to know about how the CIA can screw things up the way it did.
Mm-hmm.
And Risen wrote about this in his book, and he said he was not going to identify the source. He was subpoenaed, and the Justice Department finally let him off the hook and didn't force him to identify the source. Jeffrey Sterling was convicted anyway, even without that identification. But Jim Risen told me, and I have a long interview with him in the book. He told me that actually his very public determination not to reveal his source had made people more confident about talking with him because they knew that he would protect them. So it can work both ways. If you're brave enough as a reporter to stand up and be willing to go to jail, and Jim was willing to, I'm quite sure he would have gone to jail if it had come to that.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we let you go, Edward Snowden, champion of free speech or cowardly traitor?
Well, that word traitor is thrown around very loosely, isn't it?
Indeed.
He's not a traitor. I mean, a traitor is somebody who gives secrets to the enemy with the idea of having the enemy prevail over his own country. So that's hardly the situation with Snowden. I mean, he disclosed things that he felt were examples of wrongdoing by the NSA in this broad surveillance of ordinary Americans who were not under any suspicion of anything, collecting all of our metadata, what's called metadata, which is the phone numbers that we're in connection with and the email addresses we're in contact with. And by the way, a lot of people don't know this, metadata also includes the subject lines of your emails. So be careful what you put in your subject lines. And I think that, and then, he disclosed the spying that we were doing on Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and the Brazilian prime minister, and so forth. So, and I think that it was very helpful to Americans' ability to understand what their country was doing, and I commend him for it. I think I think that he and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, who were the two journalists who worked with him on this, were pretty judicious in what they released. It was not like the Chelsea Manning document dump to WikiLeaks, where everything that she got a hold of, it was just sort of en masse dumped on WikiLeaks. I think that the Snowden documents were pretty carefully selected, as far as I could tell.
Very much different cases.
I think very different.
Yeah. All right, Dave Shipler, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His latest book, Freedom of Speech, Mightier Than the Sword. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Lee Drutman has written about the explosion of lobbying and political fundraising and believes that corporations are not influencing elections as much as a bunch of rich guys are. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Wow! Exclaimed a beaming Donald Trump as he stepped on stage, basking in the cheers of a throng attending his launch into the 2016 presidential race. That is some group of people, he gushed, thousands. It was a showbiz extravaganza, literally. The crowd was cheering the self-promoting hypester who wants to be president, but not necessarily supporting him. That's because some of these over-the-top enthusiasts were actors. Yes, hired at $50 a pop to do a 3-hour gig as Donnie's crowd. Extra-mile casting had been retained to puff up the audience. We are looking to cast people for the event to wear T-shirts and carry signs and help cheer him, said Extra Mile in an email to its list of actors who work as extras in films, TV shows, etc. When the Donald Show was over, the extras dumped their signs in the trash and went to their next acting gig. For his part, Trump delivered a rambling, almost incoherent 40-minute rant. Citing his chief qualification for the highest office in our land, he said, "I'm really rich. And by the way, I'm not even saying that in a braggadocious. That's the kind of thinking you need for this country." And his immigration policy is simply, well, simplistic. "I would build a great wall, and nobody builds walls better than me, believe me." Wow, apparently he intends to build the wall himself. Then he added a jingoistic gringoism to this good neighbor policy, declaring, "And I'll have Mexico pay for that wall." And what's his economic policy, you ask? It's a whopper. "I will be the greatest jobs president God ever created," he bellowed. This is Jim Hightower saying, No, Donnie, don't even try to blame God for creating you or your nuttiness. You truly are a self-made man, spawned from the fumes of your own gaseous ego. Yet, you're a godsend for those of us seeking comic relief in politics.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Lee Drutman studies the role of influence peddling in government and says that corporations spend 34 times as much as issue advocacy groups. And that, he concludes, is just not a fair fight. And we say hello to Lee Drutman, political scientist who researches political influence. He's a fellow at New America and the author of the book, The Business of America is Lobbying, How Corporations Became Politicized and Politics Became Corporate. Lee Drutman, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Pleasure to be with you.
Nice to speak with you as well. You make the interesting claim that the notorious Citizens United Supreme Court decision is not influencing elections as much as was feared. Why is that?
Well, for one, it was not like we had some halcyon period prior to 2010 when we had this wonderful election system where everybody participated equally. I mean, things were pretty screwed up before Citizens United. I mean, so it made a bad system marginally worse. But the thing that I think has surprised a lot of people or that we is that a lot of people said, well, okay, now corporations can spend these unlimited sums in independent expenditures. The super PACs were formed. But when you look at who is actually contributing to these super PACs, it's rich guys like Sheldon Adelson and Tom Steyer, Michael Bloomberg. Right? So it's not big corporations now, and in part because they don't get a lot of leverage from participating in the electoral space. They spend so much more money on lobbying. That's where the real action is. So I think what has changed is that even though it's true that you had big donors prior to Citizens United, you had the 527 groups, Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. You had George Soros spending lots of money in the 2004 election, but it sort of there was almost a cultural shift where I think a lot of really rich people said, oh, now it's appropriate to spend 10, 20, $50 million. And partially, I think now you had vehicles in which they could do that, and probably a lot of it has to do with very good fundraisers for both of the parties.
Well, then, if not to the corporations, as Citizens United then turned the elections over to the Sheldon Adelsons and Tom Steyers of the world?
Well, it certainly made them important players. It's made them gatekeepers in a sense of who gets to run and who doesn't. But then again, what's interesting is that one of the things that Sheldon Adelson really, really wanted was to pass a ban on online gambling. And that failed. He did not get that, and in part because the supporters of online gambling, the Poker Players Association and others, were able to turn it back and say that this is an example of crony capitalism or quid pro quo corruption if Congress passes this, and that really hurt the cause of Adelson by making him such a central player in all of this, right? So there's a danger in spending too much money.
The recent uproar over religious freedom laws in various states is an example of corporations now not wanting to get overly involved in issues for fear of alienating large numbers of customers?
I don't know. I think some companies have gotten involved in this, and particularly CEOs a number of CEOs feel somewhat passionately about this, and there are certainly CEOs who sometimes their own emotional involvement in issues is just what causes them to say something. I think, but on this issue, on the issue of gay rights, I think there's a large and growing public support for these issues, and for a company like Apple, which has been vocal on it, like that is a very important part of their market is progressive people who support gay rights, I think. So I'm not. I think this is it's a complicated issue when companies try to stay back, and when they speak out on issues, and
that fine line that they got to be careful about crossing.
Yeah, it is a fine line, and some companies do it well, and some companies don't, and there's a lot of pressure from consumers on both sides often. Mm-hmm.
We're speaking with Lee Drutman, political scientist, fellow at New America, and author of the book, The Business of America is Lobbying, How Corporations Became Politicized and Politics Became Corporate. Lee, one of the other things that you talk about, really big money is going to corporate lobbying. What is the extent of it? How much does it tilt the playing field against progressive, issue-oriented lobbies?
Oh, it's incredible how imbalanced it is. I was surprised when I crunch the numbers, but if you take all the lobbying that corporations spend both individually and through associations on one side, and then you count up all the lobbying that labor unions and public interest groups, and I include public interest groups on both left and right public interest groups, any group that claims to be representing a public. So you total all the groups that claim to be representing the public interest and the labor unions. For every $1 that they spend on lobbying combined, corporations and their associations spend $34. So it's a 34 to 1 ratio, and that ratio, by the way, has been steadily increasing. I was able to go back to 1998, the earliest I could get good data. It was 22 to 1 then. It's gone from 22 to 1 to 34 to 1. So it's just not a fair fight. We have this idea that goes back to Madison that American democracy works best when you have faction counteracting faction. That's how Madison put it. Faction was his word for what we would call special interests, because remember, back then there were no political parties. So there's this idea in American democracy we have a kind of decentralized system. We have checks and balances, and out of this rough and tumble battle of different interests will come, no side has a monopoly on the truth, but out of this competition comes the public interest. Well, what we have now is that corporations have just crowded everybody else out. It's not faction counteracting faction, it's faction crowding out faction.
Any evidence that lobbyists are perhaps getting tired of making contributions to so many members of Congress? And don't corporations realize that they may not be getting as much for their money as their lobbyists claim?
I think there is a lot of evidence in interviewing a bunch of lobbyists for my book, The Business of America is Lobbying. I found a number of lobbyists who really complained about it. They feel like members of Congress are constantly hectoring them to come to their fundraising events, and it kind of makes them feel cheap, honestly. I think a lot of lobbyists think that they can make a good merit on their cases. on the case, and they really don't like being begged for money. And I think a lot of companies would prefer not to have to make those donations, or actually, the companies don't make the donations themselves. It's the employees at the company who bring their money together into a political action committee. And I think a lot of employees don't really like having to do that either. But it's hard to change that system, because for all that politicians complain about it too. They hate it. But the people who are in office now are those who have made this system work for them. They know it. They understand it. They're good at it. Essentially, we've set up a fundraising demands on Congress that require that the number one quality of running for Congress is being a really, really good telemarketer.
Right. Which just kind of leaves you scratching your head sometimes. If the power of corporations and of political action committees continues to grow, will that diminish the importance of the two political parties?
That's a great question. I think that what's happening is it's hard to power is a hard thing to measure or to quantify. I think what's happened is that corporations as they've become more involved in politics, have kind of crowded out everyone else, so that in order to enact major policy, it basically requires that you have to have large corporations on board, and they providing resources, helping to build coalition, helping to draft legislation. So the parties, Congress, nor the parties are really independent actors. They rely on for basic policy capacity. Increasingly, they rely on outside lobbyists. So to the extent that those outside lobbyists mostly represent large companies, that limits what the parties can do policy-wise.
All right. Lee Drutman, political scientist, fellow at New America, author of the book, The Business of America is Lobbying, How Corporations Became Politicized and Politics Became Corporate. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Well, pleasure to be with you.
All right. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, TPP opponent, Congressman Paul Tonko.
So let's go back to the trade issue.
Sure.
What about this trade deal was so important to you that you gave up so much time to try to stop it?
Jobs. Absolutely jobs. You know, the number one priority, beyond any, is putting together an agenda that cultivates jobs. Government doesn't grow those jobs, but it certainly can provide a climate. And the climate here is, to address a fair and level playing field. We don't get that with these agreements. What we do get is an unbalanced trade. When people find you're whipping against fast track, sometimes they will leap to the conclusion, well, you're against trade. No, nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm for trade. I want fair trade, not free trade. And I think there's a difference. So a number of people, led by Rosa DeLauro and a few of us that were whipping, were pointing out the injustice of NAFTA. And this is basically NAFTA on steroids, because we're talking about 40% of the world's economy. And
huge. And what do you think the impact will be then on jobs? Obviously a negative impact, but like how so? Jobs going overseas?
Right. I mean, there's a trade deficit that has ballooned. And if we want to talk about dents in the American economy, a trade deficit can provide a great dent into our economy. And so meaningful jobs from the manufacturing sector oftentimes are the sacrifice. I mean, there are ripple effects. There are in there are other forces that come into play after you lose those manufacturing jobs. But, my district is the donor district to the mouth of the Erie Canal. And that Erie Canal developed a necklace of communities dubbed mill towns. Mm-hmm. And so these manufacturing centers, it's where many of our immigrant ancestors tethered their American dream. And that American dream is about the economic ladders of opportunity, working your fingers to the bones, and giving a better life to your kids and grandkids to follow. And that still continues. That mosaic, that ethnic mosaic continues to grow. And those who have been given the chance as generations out to call America home need to further strengthen that American dream. And we lose that opportunity with stuff like this. When people talked about fast track perhaps back in President Nixon's time, it might have been about, doing an expedited programming of addressing tariffs and trade barriers. But it's gone well beyond that. It's gone well beyond it. You put public policy into these documents, environmental standards, public safety, public health situations, the right to collective bargaining. All of these issues are woven into this. And, we want to make certain that the regs that guide this nation's manufacturers are not weaker in other areas, and that's where the imbalance comes.
Now, I go to the White House every day when I'm in town for the briefings, and I've heard the President say and Press Secretary Josh Earnest say over and over that this is the strongest trade deal that has ever come down the pike, that has got the strongest environmental protections, the strongest worker protections of everything, and it's a good deal for American workers.
Well, it's good to that you can say that, but, the bottom line, big concern here is enforceability. And we can have whatever documentation in these negotiated settlements, but we need to enforce them. And the enforceability track record has been dismal. And you want to make certain that, the standards...
Plus you got the record of NAFTA to look at.
Right. And, I have said to so many folks, and to our steel workers and Leo and all of those who lead these wonderful, powerful groups that speak to the rights of jobs for workers, the dignity of work for our American worker, they know that, the situation here is the loss of jobs, American jobs, which is a huge impact to our economy. But after that, the ripple effect is worldwide. And you can end up with standards that dumb down the check, the salary, the paycheck that the person takes home. And you have people working for 56 cents an hour in Vietnam. They have one labor union, and it's government-controlled. If you speak out against these unions, oftentimes the impact is you're incarcerated. And so, that is not the sort of social justice, economic justice that this nation should stand for.
What, as a Democrat, was it tough for you to go up against your own president?
Yes, because I like this president. I revere him. I think he's doing a great job. He stopped the bleeding of the recession. He and I are in sync on energy policy, transformation, investment in research, medical and technology-wise. I think he's done a great job in leading us. But on this one, we part company. I just do not believe that the fast track, where we circumvent Congress should be involved. We have the assignment, the responsibility to be involved in commerce situations. I'm on energy and commerce as a committee assignment. Yeah. The power of the purse rests with Congress. And so to circumvent us in such a huge a concept where 40% of the world's economy is being addressed by this agreement is not the best outcome.
The other issue that I have heard so much about is secrecy. And again, we raise it at the briefings, and the White House response is always, anybody who wants to read this document can read it. That's nonsense that this is a secret document.
Well, number one, some of the language is quite peculiar, very technical. You want to get answers to it, but you don't know if that's changing as you're reading it, or if it's been changed and you'll see it in another revision, that's down the road. Plus, oftentimes it's confidential. So you're sworn to that secrecy, and you can't express the concern for the district that you represent or a broader, a wider audience. And with the fast track, we get very little conversation on the House floor. Limited debate, no robust debate, and you get a thumbs up or thumbs down on the package. So I think that we're going to have to think our way through how we address the Trans-Pacific Partnership as it comes to the floor if this fast track is approved, which people expect will be the case.
Yeah, it looks like it will be in the Senate. No, and then your role, basically, you're just, as you said, you like it all or you don't like it all, nothing in between, no amendments, no nothing, which is, if I were a Republican or a Democrat in Congress, I'd have a problem with,
Well,
I'm more than a potted plant. Your colleague and your confrere, I guess we used to say, Jerry Nadler, Congressman Jerry Nadler, will be joining us, Congressman, at the top of the next hour.
Yeah, great. So we're all pleased to be part of that full court press.
Yeah. Back-to-back New Yorkers.
We're in New York state of mind, I guess.
Speaking of New York, can I just make one quick mention on the trade?
Absolutely.
Oftentimes people don't see agriculture as a huge industry in New York, but it is an amazingly important industry. And the ag economy controls how the general economy works in upstate New York. I'm concerned that what happened to manufacturing with this trade outcome with NAFTA will impact agriculture in the same way. And if we end up importing our food that we require, and if we see these inspection rates stay at what they are, I get worried about the economics of that and the public health, public safety elements of that. There is documentation of ag jobs in this country being displaced by NAFTA, where some of the corporations did their vineyards or whatever in certain locations and then imported their product into the country and at the same time displaced the American worker. So, we could have the same ripple effect upon the ag community. And, you're a Chobani fan, and that's New York-based.
Absolutely.
So, that will...
And also, we've a big affiliate up in Ithaca, New York, which I've been up there a couple of times, and that big agricultural school at
Cornell.
At Cornell, right? Yeah. And just going through that area, I mean, it's huge.
As they say, Ithaca is gorgeous.
Yes, indeed.
So, those gorgeous are great.
One other aspect of this trade deal that I don't think got much attention, and Larry Cohen from the Communication Workers talked about it here on our program, which is these panels, arbitration panels or whatever, or conflict of interest, or whatever the panels were.
ISDS, the tribunals.
ISDS, yes. So that a corporation doesn't like the laws or the rules of a country. They say, like there are cases like this. Like Philip Morris is right now suing Uruguay and I think Australia because they say, no, we don't like these restrictions on the packaging on our cigarettes. And they can appeal to this panel and override.
Which is stacked with corporate types. It is totally corporate voices. So the track record here is dismal. It's like, I don't like this regulation. It requires more cost in doing business. Get rid of it. And so the standards that people have worked on to protect the environment, to provide for general well-being, dignity and fairness for workers, these could be wiped away.
So at least in theory, right, these corporations, they could undermine the sovereignty of the United States.
You're right.
U.S. laws. They could overturn or go around a U.S. law.
And with the long-term track record here on Fast Track, it could cover perhaps 3 presidencies. And so as we move in the course of time here, you could see international banks coming in and saying, get rid of these regulations. What's that going to mean?
Right.
We saw what happened when this president assumed office. We had a huge crisis that didn't have a watchdog in the equation. And the American workers who trusted their portfolios of retirement lost everything for which they ever worked.
Lost their shirt.
So what are we doing here?
Now, speaking of upstate New York and speaking of Ithaca, Helen is on the line from up in Ithaca, New York. Hey, Helen, good to talk to you.
Hi.
Hi. What's your point?
This congressman, he's not my representative. We actually have a Republican here. But I agree with him that I am totally disgusted with this fast track idea. And I was, when I was speaking to Jamie, I was saying, why don't we refer to it as fascist track? 'track. Because, it's like, I don't know, it's like, 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 I don't want to say the name here.
Yeah, got it.
It doesn't stand for Helen. It stands for some guy from Germany. We should not give one person all this authority and take power away from our representatives in Congress.
Okay, all right, Helen, we got that point. A quick comment.
And I agree. You want give and take here. You want negotiations that are open to the public. We are the people's house. I serve in the House of Representatives. Commerce, international commerce, is an important thing. We want to be involved in the trade situation.
The Constitution gives you a role.
Absolutely, it requires us, and this is just circumventing the responsibilities of Congress, and it's wrong. And, earlier we were talking off the air, and it just amazes me what hypocrisy is involved here, because all the criticism of the president, giving him too much control with our health care, and giving him
seizing too much control.
Yes, seizing control, and now we're saying, oh no, we don't need any interaction with the with Congress. Let the executive branch do this all. So where are you on this? And is it about the friends who may like to buy seats in Congress? I don't know what the dynamic is here, but it's not pretty. And I think it's wrong, and I think the American worker is going to take it on the chin.
Well, a battle well fought, Congressman, and I still think we haven't seen the end of this yet. We got.
I hope you're right.
We got a long ways to go here too.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Shipler, Lee Drutman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cutting. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.